On the Hunt for Concrete Objects, a philosophical essay. Two strategies for scientific unification have been tried in modernity. Either describing the cosmos from a human point of view in a historical narrative, or defining general terms that cover all phenomena in a system of logical necessity. The first has drawn suspicion under the label of the grand narrative, for purportedly disguising the particular under the mask of the general to the detriment of the neglected, while the second has, deservedly, most arguments in its favor, since it constitutes the backbone of our technical civilization. This essay seeks to balance the scales a bit by weighing in on the side of historical narrative. It illustrates how concrete objects escape the grasp of general terms, argues that their vague outlines result from the variation between organisms, and speculates on a cosmic narrative that is inspired by neo-Kantianism and evolutionary biology. The Dreamer and the Patient. The ancients imagined a cosmos ruled by a rational mind, a clockwork sky adorned with intentions to be deciphered. Cicero's famous De Republica closes with the fictional account of Scipio, who meets his grandfather in a dream and is led to the stars to learn about his fate. There, he hears the celestial spheres rotate in harmony and sees humanity dwell along the temperate climatic belts of the earth. He is told all minds were sparked from the cosmic fire that gave birth to the stars. His vision is naive but beautiful, constantly shifting between big and small, part and whole. The Milky Way lies to his feet, while all stars at once are tingling in his ear. The inverse mindset is described in the eponymous story of Oliver Sacks' classic The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. The patient Dr. P has difficulties with visual recognition, although his sight is in perfect condition and his capacity for formal reasoning is highly developed. Platonic solids pose no mystery to him, but landscapes appear to him as chaotic lists of properties. He can't separate one dune from another. To identify people on photographs, he looks for typical features: Einstein's beard, Churchill's cigar. Therefore, most of his family albums are of no significance to him. He can't even tell what belongs to his body. For some reason, music gives him enough structure to perform daily tasks like dressing, so songs designated to each procedure accompany all aspects of his life. Yet in silence, he falls out of context quickly and finds himself scattered and disoriented, a bewildered man at his breakfast table, without company, sandwich, or coffee, but with plenty of square, dull, and grey to choose from. Abstractions in free fall, a world without outlines. The dreamer and the patient are surrounded by very different ontological structures. Scipio's environment is a concrete object, built of many parts, but animated by a single mind. He is interpreting it like a sculpture, a complex Atlas statue that reveals the order of things by anthropomorphizing them. Projecting human concepts into nature is a standard mode of operation for our brain, but, of course, putting a smile on the sky doesn't exactly help us understand it. Dr. P, on the other hand, might be quite a spectacle in a philosophy department. He has lost vision of the thing in itself, the ontological marker Kant assumed behind the properties we perceive to account for their clustering into distinct objects. Since the concrete doesn't present itself to Dr. P's eyes, he tries to rebuild it from the bottom up by verbal reasoning. He follows the Cartesian impulse to return to first premises and witness the world rise in logical sequences of fully articulated sentences. But he can't replace all that is missing, because many things have neither a compelling reason to exist nor a definition that covers all uses of their name. How is anybody going to convince Dr. P that faces are real? It's just a figure of speech, he might propose. Our definitions are an arbitrary net of demarcations on the world. We got one notion of face by historical accident, but we could define a better one any time. In fact, we might even get along without talk of faces. The Discourse, a cosmos made of matter and language. Generalizing Dr. P's stance of assuming as few entities as possible might result in an eliminative, materialist cosmos. Only matter and energy. The rest follows in ways yet to uncover. Or it collapses into a version of there is only language. Things are what we say they are. Either way, it will not contain what Plato was concerned with, namely the ideas our words point to, like the good and the beautiful. Likewise, there won't be emotions, neighborhoods, and genres. In the chasm of a cosmos splintered between its physico-chemical foundation and a solipsistic level of discourse, not even faces will be recognized. A number of cosmologies can be built on the dichotomy of matter and language, but they all suffer from the same defect, a neglect of subjective experience associated with the dissolution of concrete objects. Foucault's cosmos is the clearest case in that regard. He didn't doubt the blessings of engineering, so the basic grid of reality remains uncontested. Yet its canvas is purely linguistic and in constant flux. It is a Worfian world, where the discourse, the aggregate of valid statements at a given time, draws the outlines. Scholars in the humanities follow the shadows of language to interpret reason, health, freedom, sexuality, subjectivity, and other short-lived epiphenomena of discursive practice until the murmuring clouds move on, forming new patterns and leaving everyone mystified what the ancients meant when they said human. His avoidance of the subjective perspective is intentional and follows Nietzsche's advice. Interpret each layer of history as a separate system. Don't assume history has a goal. Don't invent actors to explain movement. A lightning doesn't need a lightninger. Maybe speech doesn't need a speaker. Just as Kepler's laws made the idea of angels carrying the planets obsolete, particular semantic patterns might be able to account for everything written, predicting which words enter the mind. Certainly, sentences have a way of arranging themselves and leading the author astray. Subjectively, writing feels like I was aiming at a vague image for each paragraph, waiting for sentences to put in. Their origin is outside my view, like a forest that echoes requests and releases phrases onto the pasture of consciousness, where they compete for attention. But this picture might not be original at all, no reflection of a scene occurring under the mind's eye, but language mirroring itself in a space of synonyms, a string of semantically related phrases that winds itself blindly through novels, speeches, and philosophy papers, independent of any personal experience. In the discourse of ancient Rome, Foucault suspects, my description would be cast in martial metaphors, a fortress to be guarded against the challenges of fate, with a gallery of ancestors to live up to. Supposedly, it would not occur to me to use anything but the tried and tested phrases ancient Latin provided. Separating the self from the origin of language would be unthinkable, because nobody had said such a thing before. In his last lectures on the hermeneutics of the subject, he even argues that the very idea of finding truth by introspection is historically contingent and largely absent in the Roman discourse. Rather, they would make truths their own by imitating examples. He sets out to show that the Enlightenment concept of a subject a priori capable of recognizing and expressing truth is a transient alignment in the sky of language. If you find yourself in a boat on the river Lethe when you imagine living in Dr. P's world, Foucault might be sitting next to you, asking if you have ever tried freediving. He wants to go deeper than Descartes. There, he tells you, it is possible to doubt not only the ability to know, to act, and to differentiate yourself from your surroundings, but even sanity and existence itself. What would it be like to emerge from such a dive? The hope of many inspired by Foucault is that descriptions and classifications limit our perceptions, while discourse analysis can overcome these arbitrary boundaries. This is why arguing against essences, true definitions, and the nature of things is its most common manifestation. Yet this hope implies some inner life not dependent on verbal expression. Otherwise, what would be lost if it was overshadowed by certain definitions? Also, the individual would have no reason to object to norms imposed upon by the discourse. How could there be a subjective experience that is overlooked, excluded, or even deliberately suppressed, if it was constituted by the very act of description? Then it should be possible to word it in and out of existence. But Scipio can't unsee faces, no matter what he's told. Neither can Dr. P be equipped with the letters to read Scipio's puzzled expression. Furthermore, to assume that a special method is required to avoid essentialism underestimates the common ability to approach a problem from different angles. Scientists in particular are rewarded for introducing new perspective, which implies an awareness of the difference between word and object. In the beginning of the 19th century, for example, little was known about the nervous system, but physicians hoped to find the causes of mental illness there. The first concepts were crude, casting the nervous system as a net of ropes controlling the homo machina, or seeking the substance of thought in the liquor, which could more accurately be described as the brain's wastewater. But deeper understanding followed in the course of decades. Broca assessed the effects of brain lesions in a clinical environment. Brodmann drew a map of the cortex based on its cellular structure, and Pavlov experimented on the behavior of dogs. You could hardly get more disparate pictures: anatomical functions and their regeneration in clinical records, networks of cells under the microscope, and charts of conditioned reflexes. Nevertheless, all three were certain to contribute to the understanding of the same object. When Foucault covers this field and time span in Madness and Civilization, he merely concludes that multiple layers of discourse invented corresponding illnesses, often reflecting the view of society on those unfit for integration. The medical progress is invisible, because the object of study is fragmented into figures of speech. Thus, working in the framework of a meta-language cosmos has the tendency to split real objects into purely verbal phenomena peculiar to separate disciplines. Face begins to mean one thing in biology, something else in sociology, an altogether different thing in philosophy, and the newest thing in the facial turn of comparative literature. But with the thing in itself having been deconstructed, there is no incentive to pay attention to other people's work on the faces. In the end, this kind of skepticism is untenable. If not cultivated in academia, subjective experience will constantly reassert itself without any scientific foundation. Then, disciplines requiring particular subjective perspectives will be mutually contested, creating an equilibrium in which ceaseless arguments are sorted by assigning kinds of knowledge to groups of people with special authority. Hardly anything could be as antithetical to the Enlightenment ethos. On the hunt for concrete objects. At the root of the matter-language cosmos lies a narrow understanding of scientific methodology that identifies knowledge with general terms. It has holes where concrete objects should be because it misses the instruments to handle them, proper names and vague boundaries, and subsequently ignores the neural substrate that sculpts them out of raw sense data. As Mill and later Kripke have pointed out, proper names do not include claims regarding the properties of their referred objects. Instead, they refer successfully when they illuminate a path towards their object, and they are empty when their object cannot be found. Let us search for Taurus to demonstrate the differences. If you look at the night sky in the northern hemisphere and you find Orion's belt, 3 bright stars forming a line, then the blurry patch next to it, the Orion Nebula, marks its downside. Extending the belt to the right leads to Taurus. The bright red star is Aldebaran, the Eye of the Bull. This star belongs both to a class, defined by a general term, and a concrete object, identified by its proper name. Calling it a red giant means attributing it with everything we know about this kind of objects. What is true for red giants is true for Aldebaran. Calling it a part of Taurus doesn't mean attributing it with anything. Taurus looks like a bull's head with long horns and strong shoulders, and covers about a 1/12 of the zodiac. That's not the case with Aldebaran. One might remark that constellations are not scientific units anyway, since our subjective impression, dependent on a naming tradition begun by herding societies, is the principle of their individuation, and not objective reality itself. This is true, and we might want to abstain from naming constellations, to prevent people from drawing wrong conclusions about the structure of our galaxy. But still, they are a great way of pointing out specific stars to others. Sailors needed to know them to navigate, and using familiar shapes is quite effective. The utility of the constellations, then, rests on a shared subjective perspective. People who know what bells and bulls look like have an easier time finding Aldebaran. This principle is not limited to perspectives among humans. Species in general are concrete objects, constellations in the tree of life, with large overlap in individual experience. Their common perspective is rooted at a much deeper level than culture or even language. A dozen and one eyes. Mapping the outlines of concrete objects depends on the abilities of animals to act. Movement comes at the expense of energy. So, from the earliest days of grazing on bacterial mats, there has been an incentive to highlight potential for success and risk of failure. Some of these systems are innate and their track record is kept in the form of DNA, while others are learned. Since organisms vary on the individual level, any consensus on these outlines is going to be vague. This is easily recognizable in the domain of geography, where landmarks are differentiated by their impact on our movement. Vague as the term mountain might be, you have certainly missed it, if you can jump it. The same goes for rivers and brooks. Imagine a number of people jumping as far as they can, leaving a mark where they landed. The pattern will have an upper limit, one densely marked area, and isolated marks up to the starting point. They might personally call any stream they can jump a brook, while the broader ones are rivers, making those terms well defined and general from their own perspective. But when they try to use brook and river in the most widely understood manner, they will take the distribution of the marks into account and bet on a boundary somewhere in the dense part. Thus, the result of all their actions will become common knowledge and a factor in the use of general terms, making their choices converge. If we were among the first animals, we would play a similar game by avoiding rocks while grazing on bacterial mats. With just a few neurons, no learning, and no language, the process would look like torpedo testing. But after some generations, multiple realizations of an evasion system based upon unconditioned responses would emerge. This is where, in a metaphorical sense, the eye for the concrete objects of geology, geography, and even astronomy was formed. Rocks, layered and towering to mountains crowned by stars, would not stand out to us if we hadn't inherited some of their equipment. It serves as the bedrock of our cortical development, where we add numerous other shapes by learning. By extension, we can expect to find an evolved readiness to perceive and learn about vague particulars at the foundation of all but the most abstract disciplines, a collection of neural eyes structuring perception to blaze trails into the future. Scipio's dream shows a vast array of them in action, projecting human categories into the darkness behind his closed eyes. It features the sense of people being present, recognition of faces, personalities and objects, social bonds, emotional interaction, intent, spatial movement and orientation, cause and effect, music and an image of the future. His impression of having been invited to the pantheon of meaning is generated by a symphony of non-verbal judgments. A good essay uses words as arrows to point at those experiences, while a bad one uses language as a smokescreen to convince us that the verbal level is all we need to see. It also seems that in each case, agency is the principle of individuation. The way we differentiate between a vortex of chemical reactions and an organism reflects the meaningful interactions our ancestors had with other branches on the tree of life. Animals and plants attract our attention most and are immediately segmented into functional parts like teeth, eyes, or horns, while microbes are only apparent in the aggregate as stains or smells. Before we had antibiotics, there was no opportunity to target specific elements of cell structure and therefore no reason to be equipped with suitable perception. Even on the scientific level, far beyond merely innate patterns of analysis, agency can structure data in useful ways. Judging the fitness of an organism and its constituent parts presupposes a drive to reproduce, which, stated as a matter of fact, would be an overgeneralization. But this hypothesis highlights the path of reproduction from one generation to the other, revealing obstacles to overcome and making it possible to qualify and quantify the contribution of each body part and behavior to the continuity of the lineage. Therefore, our understanding of anatomical function rests on our tendency to attribute intentions to movement. A similar case can be made for the study of language. What makes a sentence the basic unit of linguistics? Remembering symbols or uttering sounds with fixed meanings is usually regarded as insufficient. Verbs are necessary, the class of words denoting action. Chomsky, for example, assumes the minimum of grammar consisted of a subject and a predicate. This is reflected in our anatomy. The Broca area, the part of the cortex that produces grammar, is at the same time responsible for hand gestures, maybe its sole role in our primate ancestors' brains. Thus, recognizing agency in others, the will to do something, might have been the evolutionary game our predecessors played when they distributed linguistic capacity in our gene pool. On the macro level, the distinction between different languages is contingent on the individual's ability to understand others. In areas where languages had hundreds of years to develop, Dialects change subtly from one village to another, getting harder and harder to comprehend along the way until they sound utterly unfamiliar. Depending on their ability to understand people, observers would mark the border between language areas along different lines. The cosmos as a concrete object. In the 19th century, Wilhelm Windelband and Heinrich Rickert have suggested viewing the cosmos from two perspectives. While natural sciences, in Rickert's terminology, abstract from particular objects to create systems of logical necessity, historical sciences map particular objects, not only in order to understand how they came to be, but also to know their place in the present. Two examples in astronomy are Kepler's laws and the moons of Jupiter, one advancing natural science, the other expanding natural history. Our planet Earth, the tree of life, the language families, and our traditions and institutions are instances of concrete objects that lie at the foundation of historical disciplines entirely dedicated to their study. Combining our knowledge about concrete objects results in an image of the cosmos that is distinctly more human and recognizable than a theory of everything could be. Its form would be historical, starting from the formation of matter in celestial bodies, continuing through the eons of geology and evolutionary history, while gradually adding elements of animal cognition and interaction, to finally arrive at the realms of written history with its myriad traditions. Its building blocks represent the environment for the purposes of active organisms, with some being fundamental to almost all of them, and others being peculiar even among humans. Which brings us back to the definition of face. For Dr. P, there are no faces. Their impression is created in a brain area called the fusiform gyrus, which is usually damaged when people suffer from face blindness. It analyzes visual data, not to give us sight, but knowledge. This person over there is the same as yesterday. Happy to see you, but in the middle of some other thought. Gaining these insights is like listening to music and inferring movement, space, and emotion. Defining face for Dr. P then consists in pointing out the distribution of facial recognition systems and the anatomical features that have evolved in their presence. Genus proximum and differentia specifica won't suffice. Animals living in individualized groups count on the ability to tell one from another. Since each of their behavioral dispositions are different and meaningful, it makes sense to track them individually and store memories accordingly. This need can be met in various ways. One of them is smell. But primates have, for one reason or another, begun to rely on visual data, and their faces are adapted to display socially relevant information, like emotional state or age. So, Dr. P might consider using the term face to understand the interaction of others, although he himself could do well without.